Japji Sahib, meditation of the soul. God and we are one. This is our true identity. The doer of everything, beyond fear, beyond revenge, beyond death, image of the infinite, unborn, full of light, the Guru's gift. Meditate. Primal truth, true for all time, true at this instant, O Nanak, forever true.
Hello there and welcome to you. Welcome to an exploration of the fourth way in Gurdjieff's teachings. Today I want to look more closely at the particular instructions that Gurdjieff gave in order to enable a human being within the complex machinery of his organism to create fine matters and ultimately to enter into a higher kind of life. Gurdjieff gave two particular exercises that were to concord with the rest of the processes inside of a man, and I'll look closely at them in a minute. And I have something from A.R.Orage and something from Fritz Peters. This diagram shows the energetic transformations that occur inside of an ordinary man. What does the diagram mean? It means that man is divided into three zones, and each one has inputs and outputs: the head, the chest, and the lower part of the body, the intellectual, emotional, and the moving center. And they have different transformations, and the inputs that come into the body being food, air, and what Gurdjieff calls our impressions, the things we see and hear and receive from the outside in that way, are treated as materials that are gradually processed by us in the same way that a sheep processes air and grass to make wool. This is very sophisticated, and he considered that a spiritualized person was producing higher materials and performing certain practices in order to make that happen, and that this transformation followed the laws of the octave. In other words, there were a certain sequence of steps that could be considered universal. The steps are always the same, no matter on which scale they are occurring. And in that octave there were two places which required a special work, which required special study and special methods. Man has the possibility of increasing the output of these inner mechanisms. For this purpose, it is necessary to create a special kind of artificial shock at the point where the beginning of the third octave is arrested in an ordinary man. This shock is connected with the moment of the reception of an impression from the outside. The note Do 48 designates the moment when an impression enters our consciousness, and an artificial shock at this point means a certain kind of effort made at the moment of receiving that impression. It has been explained before that in ordinary conditions of life we do not remember ourselves. That is, we do not feel ourselves and are not aware of ourselves at the moment of a perception, of an emotion, of a thought, of an action. If a man understands this and tries to remember himself, every impression he receives will, so to speak, be doubled. In an ordinary state, I simply look at a street, but if I remember myself simultaneously, I do not simply look at the street. I feel that I am looking, as though I was saying to myself, I am looking. Instead of one impression of the street, there are two impressions. One of the street and another of myself looking at it. And the second impression produced by the fact of my remembering myself is the additional shock. Moreover, it very often happens that the additional sensation connected with self-remembering brings with it an element of emotion. That is, the work of the machine attracts a certain amount of carbon-12 to the place in question. So, efforts to remember oneself, observation of oneself at the moment of receiving an impression, observation of one's impressions at the moment of receiving them, registering the reception of an impression, and the simultaneous defining of the impressions received. All of this, taken together, doubles the intensity of the impressions. And this is a conscious effort made at the moment an impression is received. It is necessary to understand what this means. We all breathe the same air, and apart from the elements known to our science, the air contains a great number of substances that are unknown to our science, that are indefinable for it and inaccessible to its observation and methods. But exact analysis is possible both on the air inhaled and the air exhaled. This exact analysis shows that although the air inhaled by different people is exactly the same, the air exhaled is quite different. And there is a second activity that can cause the two octaves to develop even further, being a second conscious shock. The nature of this particular effort demands a special study, and from the point of view of the general work of the machine, it can be said in general that this effort is connected with the emotional life. That is, it's a special kind of influence over one's emotion. And the practice of not expressing unpleasant emotions, of not identifying, and of not considering inwardly is the preparation for the second effort. And for the moment, this effort can only be explained in connection with a general description of the work of the human factory. So Gurdjieff's descriptions are quite subtle and include several different steps, and they are a living connection. They turn our lives into a living current. It's certainly not like the present moment when you sit in the present moment and you try, just to be here. It's not like that. It is trying to create strong energy flows within us of a psychic kind. In other words, to be more vitally alive in our consciousness and our psyche, even in our breathing, to extract more, and to have a slight shifting of our will towards those ends. And in terms of this second type of exercise, to have an influence over emotions, to bring them to a more sacred state, basically, in a very unsacred world. Yesterday something really stupid. I was in the car and the temperature on the dashboard is in Fahrenheit, and it's been like that for a long time, and I was looking through the instructions to find out how to switch it to centigrade. And I collected from the internet some instructions and tried them, and they didn't work. Then I tried again and they didn't work. I tried a third time and they didn't work, and they involved pressing the trip button, pressing the restart button on the steering wheel, and so on. And finally I found yet another set of instructions, and I tried them this way, that way, up, and finally the dash switched from Fahrenheit to centigrade. And it's a small thing, but basically the people on this planet, on this coarse planet, on this low planet, on this declining planet, do this to you. They force you to run around in circles because they are unable to give you a straight answer. And I'm starting to notice this, how people actually wind down the lives of each other. Not just war, it's actually simply intruding and impeding each other and leading each other up the garden path. Not particularly deliberately, but simply through incompetence and through lack of knowledge. Very little of the material that is in human society today is connected to the absolute. It is all law of accident. Last week I was reading something called the Rhinoceros Sutra, which is one of the early sutras of Buddha, where he says, "Wander alone, like a rhinoceros." And he talks about the unreliability of the world, as it is today. And he says that the world today is unreliable. And interestingly, I also saw the Dalai Lama in conversation with a journalist, and she asked him, how are we supposed to understand emptiness in the modern world? And the Dalai Lama said, well, when you look at something, you see its appearance, but if you look deeper, you see it's empty. For instance, if you take a cat and you stick it in an oven and incinerate it, then it's turned to ash, because it was always ash, wasn't it? No, it wasn't always ash. That's the level. Even the Dalai Lama doesn't really understand it. He's kind of reduced. The knowledge that he has fallen all the way down the octave until there is zero. And some people say that you should believe in God or hope for God or have faith in God, but they have lost the knowledge that is in between the poles. They have lost the sense of the cosmos and our position in the cosmos at a certain position in the octave with a certain kind of work. The reason why modern people always talk in terms of molecules and stuff is because they no longer retain knowledge of a higher circulation, of a higher type. So everything is always reduced to the physical or the molecules, and they just don't accept anything else. Like they don't feel the psychic phenomena of a cat. They don't feel the presence or the will of an animal or a plant. Most of them don't anyway. And the decline of civilizational values that we see in the modern world is exactly this. And it's inside the leaders of world religions as well. This is A.R.Orage from the 4th of February 1930, a talk on parables. The meanings for all the words in this system have their orientation. For us, all the words have a meaning relative to consciousness connected with them. A parable is a verbal form intended to produce a certain effect. The parable as used in this system is not to establish analogy. It is to establish a truth in at least 2 centers and generally in 3. It is not just the same thing as the moving center producing repercussions in the other 2 centers. The parable strikes the centers simultaneously. There is an organic relationship started between the centers by a parable. The figures in Beelzebub's tales are mythological, and their language is parabolical. The language of these being-created figures cannot be ordinary. The parable is their language. The mythological figures is credited with the consciousness of a 3-centered being. Jesus, a mythological figure, spoke in parables because he had a 3-centered development. The developed conscious being puts more into his speech than a mechanical being, and so more is read into what he has to say. 3 meanings, 1 for each center. For example, the text of John, it is said, can be read in 7 forms by a conscious being. It can be read as an allegory, a parable. The 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th ways are not given, and the 7th can be transcendentally. It may be read in its simplest form, allegorically, and so on till it becomes an oracle. Can parable be unconscious? Yes, the parable has not only the line of the story, but the state of the psyche of the writer. It is not a work of art unless done consciously. Gurdjieff's Beelzebub is a mythological character with parabolic utterances. In the story of the history of the races in the book, Gurdjieff does not always purport to put down facts. What he has in mind is 3 centers in talking of races. He says, I don't claim it is right, but you can't prove it wrong. Why was the king's name in ancient Atlantis Apollos? We can't prove that it wasn't. Jesus took very familiar experiences as illustrations. In the Gospels, these became more complex. A miracle is not to be taken as a fact, but as plausible. 5 loaves and 2 fishes might have meant 5 diagrams and 2 statements. The truth was put into simple stories and words because a story is more likely to be handed down and its meaning may be kept intact, while less simple words would be documents which would lose more quickly their meaning and probably be tucked away in archives. Meanings in the old fairy tales, Hop o' My Thumb was the 7th son, the most despised, the smallest, that saved all the other 6. Little Boy Blue, full of meaning, was told to propagate safely the truth it carries. The truth was the running downhill of the 3 centers. Much the same meaning as the story of the sleeping passenger in the story of Horse, Coach, Driver and Sleeping Passenger. The magnetic center of young children begins to be filled by fairy tales. The new fairy tales do not do that. Perhaps Alice in Wonderland is the one exception. There are no good modern fairy tales, as no one has the development to write one with meaning. Also, the reading of a story with inner significance has no meaning without understanding in the reader. Reading a parable is an act of understanding. The passages in the book about Bolshevism, taken literally, are crude, but they are to be taken as analogies of revolting centres. The meaning of these passages, and indeed the entire book, is not to be arrived at by the mind, but by a species of new understanding. A mind which ponders is capable of understanding more meaning. Kingdom of heaven, bread, upper room, etc. all had a technical meaning at the time of their use. Some current words of science used in the book, such as anode and cathode, may be no more understandable in a few hundred years than the words like elixir of life or philosopher's stone, used by the alchemists of the past. It is not safe to take literally the meaning of the book. The words are used only as platforms for the content that is to be understood. How does one go about getting the key to a parable? The supposition is that something must be known of a method back of it. The key to the Bible was entirely lost or swallowed up by the Church. The Bible, the Old Testament, do, re, mi, the two triads of the octave. The New Testament, sol, la, si. The interval between fa was the history of Jesus and the history of his becoming Christ. Christ was born between the two triads, the interval. The interval is the incarnation of the universe. See the universe in a grain of sand. The dewdrop does not slip into the sea, but the sea into the dewdrop. Christ was a conscious creature. In the Old Testament, the development of man, do, re, mi, parabolic history of man, with the three lowest centers. In the New Testament, the development of man, sol, la, si, parabolic history of man, when he begins self-consciously to change in his psyche. The exodus of the Jews, the crossing of the Red Sea, are not substantiated in history. There may never have been such occurrences, but certain facts might be true and the stories were used parabolically. Just as the Bible must be regarded as parabolical, so must Gurdjieff's be taken as a kind of Bible. Why is the method given in parable and not in fact? One reason can be found in the parable of the sower. We may give a story that may be remembered and carried down even though the hearer did not understand. Its form would be carried, ready for understanding in the future. If written down as fact, it would lead to verbalization and intellectualization. It would not lead to formulation and understanding. I bury the bone for the dog to smell and dig it out. He mentions the parable with the 5 loaves, and A.R.Orage cannot decode that story, which I find quite shocking. He says the Old Testament, do, re, mi, the two triads of the octave, but there are no two triads in an octave. There are 3. Which means he does not understand the structure of the octave. Orage was a highly educated and literary man who had a beautiful tongue and could, talk about all these stories, and people absolutely adore that, but he doesn't actually know what he's talking about. Many of the stories of Jesus are simply verbatim alchemical instructions. And the only reason you think they're parables is because there isn't anyone around who can decode them. And the only reason I can decode them is because I've studied the Eastern arts, particularly the Chinese arts, which are in pretty good shape, and many of the methods there have 7 steps or 7 parts or 7 ideas, and it's all kind of there. It's not hidden. But Western people love to talk about meditation without ever having been to a meditation school. Similar kind of language you find in Rudolf Steiner, and I happened to be in a meetup group yesterday. I joined a couple of meetup groups in order to, meet some people, some in person, some online. And that particular Steiner group that I was in was attended by maybe 50 people, most of them quite aged and very experienced people. And although they had a very nice spirit and a kind of etheric, sacred feeling about them that I could experience, they did not really understand things very clearly, particularly because they have no methods. They actually have no methods. They have a few exercises like the exercises that people think are Gurdjieff's teaching, which they do a little bit here, a little bit there, but it's not really enough. Somehow those kinds of little bit exercises appealed to Western people. Let me skip the thing with Fritz Peters and instead I will go to the Sikh Dharma and read some of their prayers that are in the Guru Granth Sahib. Gauri, 5th Mahal. I am a sacrifice dedicated hundreds of thousands of times to my Lord and Master. Nanak receives the Naam in the Sad Sangat, the company of the holy. His name and His name alone is the support of the breath of life. You alone are the doer, the cause of all causes. You are the support of all beings and creatures. O God, you are my power, authority and youth. All places are filled with fear, know this well. Only the servants of God are free from fear. This is a direct invocation to surrender your ego into the real self hundreds of thousands of times and to remain inside the state of God, or as Shivapuri Baba would say, think only of God. He said that to J.G. Bennett, of course. Think only of God, meaning remain in the presence of God. Bring God to mind and surrender everything else, because everything else is vanity and stupidity and negativity. Gurdjieff would say faith in consciousness, in other words, enter into your consciousness and remain there. Siddharameshwar would say that the true practice is to remain within yourself and not go out. The Catholics would say remain in the state of grace. All equivalent, really. The world, the maya that is inside of people, has only one duty, which is to prevent you from entering into the sacred position of your soul. And it is very good at its job. And sometimes when you're walking down the street, you see so much stupidity that it's hard to even know how these things were developed generation by generation. And time rolls on and you have to act, otherwise the ground is coming to meet you. One has to try and do what has been taught, rather than just to listen. Take care.